Imagine waking up to the sound of church bells and screaming. You stumble out of bed, not onto carpet, but onto straw covered in fleas and the stench of the chamber pot under your cot. Outside, the streets are filled with filth, human waste, rotting food, and dogs fighting over scraps. You cover your nose with a cloth soaked in herbs, not for fashion, but to survive the stench. A neighbor limps by, his leg bandaged and oozing. He's been bled with leeches again. Down the street, a healer chants prayers while applying a mixture of onion paste and ashes to a dying child. No one questions the cure because in the medieval world, disease isn't science. It's punishment. It's divine. And when blood must be spilled to restore balance, they spill it freely and with conviction. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where blood, fear, and faith are the only things keeping you alive. And where leeches, yes, real, living leeches, were once trusted more than logic itself. Today, we know that bacteria and viruses cause disease. We have microscopes, antibiotics, and hygiene. But in medieval Europe, none of that existed because no one even knew germs were real. Imagine living in a world where invisible forces ruled your health: spirits, sin, and stars. The most common theory: the four humors. According to ancient Greek and Roman teachings, your body contained 4 fluids, and if they were out of balance, you got sick. Too much blood? You might be feverish and impulsive, time to drain it. Too much black bile? You're melancholic and ill. Better eat cold, dry foods, or maybe try purging. Even personality was tied to humors. If you were hot-tempered, that was your bile talking. The idea wasn't superstition, not to them. It was science inherited from Hippocrates and Galen. But it was science frozen in time. And as Europe suffered plagues and fevers, doctors clung to these ancient ideas like a lifeline. They didn't ask what caused the disease. They asked, what humor is out of balance? What's the patient's astrological sign? Has he sinned lately? Because sickness, in their eyes, wasn't just physical, it was cosmic, moral, even spiritual. And if that meant cutting a vein, drinking powdered pearls, or stuffing onions in your ears, so be it. To live in medieval Europe was to fight the unknown, not with science, but with rituals, relics, and recipes passed down through centuries. And when the Black Death arrived, all of it, every chant, every bleeding bowl, every poultice would be put to the test. It began like a whisper, a rumor from the east, of a sickness so swift, so cruel, it could empty a city in days. By 1347, it had reached Europe, smuggled in on fleas, riding the backs of rats aboard Genoese trading ships. The first to die were sailors in Sicily, then the dock workers, then their families. Towns sealed their gates, but it didn't matter. The plague didn't knock. It seeped through cracks. Within months, it spread like fire to France, Spain, England, Germany, even distant Norway. Some called it the Great Mortality. Others just called it God's wrath. The symptoms were unmistakable. A sudden fever, vomiting, and then the lumps, black, oozing swellings in the armpits and groin. These buboes gave the disease its most infamous name, the bubonic plague. Once the swellings appeared, death usually followed in 2 or 3 days. There was no cure, no understanding, only fear. Some towns turned to religion. They held mass processions, whipped themselves, begged forgiveness for imagined sins. Others turned to violence, blaming lepers, foreigners, and even Jews for poisoning the wells. Panic became its own kind of contagion. And in this chaos, medicine could offer little more than superstition. But that didn't stop doctors from trying. Some offered potions. Others suggested bloodletting or burning sweet herbs. And one of the most bizarre ideas of all was to stuff raw onions into your nose. Strange? Yes. But in a world that was dying, even the absurd felt like hope. They came dressed in black, silent figures gliding through the streets like omens, beaked masks, long cloaks, leather gloves. These were the plague doctors, part physician, part undertaker, part myth. Their most striking feature? The beaked mask, packed with herbs, spices, and dried flowers to purify the air. People believed that disease traveled in bad air, what they called miasma. So the beak wasn't just dramatic, it was survival. But these doctors weren't miracle workers. Most had no medical training. They were hired by cities to count the dead, not cure the sick. They carried wooden canes not for walking, but for prodding patients from a distance, or warding off desperate relatives. Still, their arrival brought hope, or at least structure. They documented symptoms. They kept death rolls. They quarantined homes. Their treatments, though, were another story. Bloodletting was common. So was attaching live leeches. Some burned aromatic herbs like rosemary or juniper in patients' rooms, hoping the smoke would drive out the plague. Others advised boiling onions with vinegar and drinking the result, or stuffing raw onions under the arms. There were no standardized cures, only trial, error, and superstition. If a patient lived, the doctor was praised. If not, God was blamed. Some doctors fled at the first sign of fever. Others stayed until they themselves fell ill. In the end, the beaked doctor became more symbol than savior, a black silhouette etched into Europe's nightmares. And though their methods were crude and often useless, they were the closest thing medieval people had to medicine. Imagine you're sick with the plague. Fever burning, limbs aching, swellings growing like angry boils under your skin. You lie on a straw mattress in a dark, musty room. There is no hospital, at least not the kind we think of today. You're at home or in a makeshift plague house with family members afraid to come too close. The room stinks of unwashed bodies, dried blood, rotting food, and death. Windows are shuttered tight to keep out the bad air. Your local healer might have visited. Maybe they gave you a poultice of herbs, or cut your skin open to let the evil humors escape. Or perhaps the town physician arrived in full plague regalia. He stands in the doorway, never crossing the threshold. On your bedside table, garlic cloves, dried roses, maybe a small wooden cross. Next to it, a bowl of vinegar, reeking strong enough to sting the nose. Some family members burn dried herbs or amber to drive away evil spirits. Others pray. Others leave the room entirely. There is no silence here. You hear moans from neighboring houses. Bells toll outside, not for mass, but for death. The sick room itself becomes a kind of purgatory, halfway between life and death. Some try charms, amulets against the plague, drawings of saints, even written prayers pinned to clothes. If you're lucky, someone brings broth. If you're unlucky, you're simply left, a human offering to fate. There is no real cure, only rituals, hope, and time. Step outside the sick room, and you enter a different kind of nightmare, the medieval city during plague time. The first thing that hits you is the smell. A rancid mix of rotting corpses, human waste, smoke, and fear. The streets are littered with refuse. No one dares sweep them. No one wants to touch what the plague might have touched. You hear the sounds before you see the people. Bells ringing, dogs barking, a mother wailing for her child. Town criers walk the alleys, shouting out the newest death tolls, or warning people to stay indoors. The wealthier homes hang bundles of dried herbs on their doors, rosemary, lavender, wormwood. The poorer ones hang nothing at all. Fear breeds superstition. People start blaming outsiders, foreigners, lepers, witches, even stray animals. Some turn to religion with desperate fervor. Others turn to violence. Some join traveling flagellants, whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. Doctors, clergy, and merchants flee the cities, leaving behind only the sick, the poor, and the dead. Superstitions flourish. People carry pomanders, metal balls filled with sweet-smelling substances, to block the bad air. Some burn sulfur or fire cannons in the streets, hoping the noise and smoke will drive the plague away. Others pin holy charms to their clothing, carve protective symbols into their doors, or sprinkle salt around their homes. But none of it works. The plague keeps coming. Day after day, the death carts roll by, and the city, once vibrant with life, sinks into silence, smoke, and sorrow. Why was the Black Death happening? To a medieval mind, the answer was anything but simple. Others thought it came from bad air, or miasma, a foul vapor rising from swamps, graves, and decaying matter. Astrology offered another answer. The planets had aligned in a cursed formation back in 1345. Some blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells. Entire communities were wiped out in horrific pogroms. Still others blamed cats, dogs, or even lepers, anyone who was different, unlucky, or simply nearby. And how did they try to fight the plague? With a mix of fear, hope, and very questionable science. Doctors carried pomanders, wore beaked masks, and stuffed them with strong herbs like mint, cloves, and myrrh. Bloodletting was common, the idea being to release bad humors from the body. Leeches were applied to cheeks, necks, groins, anywhere the plague lumps appeared. Some believed in balancing the bodies for humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile through food, purging, or sweating. Popular remedy? Onions sliced and placed beside the sick to absorb the disease. Others burned incense or sweet-smelling woods, hoping to purify the air. Some turned to more extreme measures, drinking mercury, swallowing crushed emeralds, or applying dung poultices. And in every village, someone claimed to have the cure. Few lived to prove it. In the end, these beliefs did little to stop the plague. But they tell us how desperately people wanted to explain the inexplicable. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, Europe had changed forever. By 1353, the worst was over, but the numbers were staggering. Historians estimate that 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population perished. Entire towns disappeared. In some places, no one was left to bury the dead. In others, the dead were thrown into mass graves, sometimes without last rites. Survivors wandered abandoned roads, looking for food, shelter, or simply someone still alive. Farmlands lay untended, crops rotted, livestock starved or ran wild. But strangely, in this devastation, opportunity emerged. With so many gone, peasants were suddenly in high demand. Labor became valuable, and workers began demanding better pay. This shook the feudal system to its core. Serfs who were once bound to the land began to move, searching for better lives elsewhere. Some rulers tried to freeze wages by law, like England's Statute of Laborers in 1351, but enforcement failed. The church, once unquestioned, faced growing doubt. After all, why had God allowed the faithful to die, while sinners survived? Flagellant movements surged, bands of people whipping themselves in public to atone for humanity's sins. Art turned darker, obsessed with death and decay. In literature, in sermons, in song, the plague haunted every word. And in every village, stories were whispered of days when death came in the air, in the water, in the very breath of life. The Black Death did not just end lives. It ended an era and gave birth to a new, harsher world. The Black Death was one of the darkest moments in human history, but it also became a strange teacher. It taught us how fragile our world can be, how swiftly it can all fall apart. And yet, it also showed how resilient people can be. The plague reshaped Europe, not just demographically, but economically, socially, and spiritually. It was, in a way, the beginning of the end of the medieval world. In the decades that followed, new ideas began to stir, about science, about the body, about society. People questioned old authorities. They searched for new answers in medicine, in politics, in faith. In some ways, the seeds of the Renaissance were watered by the Black Death. But the plague's lessons weren't just for the past. Even now, centuries later, we remember how invisible threats can bring even the mightiest societies to their knees. We remember how misinformation spreads faster than disease, and how fear can turn neighbors into enemies, unless we choose compassion instead. The Black Death reminds us we are vulnerable, but we are also adaptable. In death, it taught us about life, and in despair about hope. So the next time we feel invincible, remember the people of 1348. They didn't have vaccines or science or even much understanding, but they endured, and from their survival, our world was born.